So in around 3 days' time, we should know what's going to happen in government when the National Assembly meets on Friday. As things stand, the ANC has 159 seats in the National Assembly. If the MPs from Khontobusizwe do attend the sitting, then there would be 400 MPs in the National Assembly. The ANC would need 201 votes to elect President Cyril Ramaphosa as president for a second term. If MK does not send its 58 MPs, then the ANC would need probably 172 seats. So either way, it needs support from another political party. Christopher Vandome is a senior research fellow for the Africa Programme at Chatham House, based in the UK, here at the moment. Christopher, good afternoon to you. I mean, this is a big moment for South Africa. Really, the election of our first sort of power-sharing coalition government in sort of 25 years. How significant are the next few days going to be?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. It's going to be hugely significant, but not unprecedented. I was interviewing people who were involved in the drafting of the Constitution late last year as part of an international delegation who were looking into some of this and how these politics would play out. Our assessment was that here is a constitution that was designed for multiple actors to be part of the political landscape and part of government. For 30 years, it's been dominated by this single party in the ANC and its alliance partners. And now we're having this really kind of bumpy transition to some other kind of government. And the optimists amongst us are saying, well, if you look at countries like Germany, where you have multi-party democracy, where coalitions are a regular feature and a normal thing, that's potentially a positive future scenario for South Africa. But of course, it's really, really high risk. And, there's not that many people at the moment who are confident that actually any form of coalition makeup, if it was to be a solid coalition rather than a kind of an agreement of supply and confidence, there's not that much confidence that it would actually last the full 5 years. So, this is the start of quite an unsettled and uncertain phase for South Africa. But it's really an important moment in that transition to plural democracy, multi-party democracy, with multiple actors having an input into government and into policy.
We know that there are negotiations underway. They're not happening in public. We've never done this before. So I wonder if maybe there won't be an agreement. Do you think that's possible? You seem to be suggesting maybe it's not. There will be all sorts of problems if there isn't. But having a little bit of experience of our politicians, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't reach an agreement by Friday.
Yeah, I think the solution that people were looking at very closely at the beginning of the week, and when there were these supposed leaked documents around what their ANC's priorities were, you had this kind of a loose agreement of supply and confidence, whereby they would have the DA and possibly IFP voting in favour of their chosen president, Cyril Ramaphosa. And that was kind of their top option. The second one was, well, if those opposition parties are going to be asking for more and more, then we might have to have a stronger kind of written coalition agreement beyond some simple concessions and let's vote for a president. And their apparent least favoured option was this broad allow everybody into the discussions, and that seems to be where we ended up going through the week. And a lot of commentators were saying, well, this is in line with the way in which President Ramaphosa ran his government during the last administration. It's make it as inclusive as possible, and then those who don't want to be part of it will drop out. And that seems to be where we still are at the moment. And, the parties have still been in discussions today. As you say, not a huge amount coming out from there, and people are keeping, very tight-lipped on what's going on. But it's this odd mix of being both down to the numbers in terms of how do we get someone across the line, and this seeming kind of dropping down of the priority list for the ANC and how expansive it's going to need to be in order to have a sensible kind of session on Friday, where at the very least the president can be elected and that president, in line with the constitution, can start appointing a cabinet.
One of the most important things that has happened, and we've all been talking about controversies, we've all been talking about coalitions. So something else has happened, which is really important, and it's happened very quietly almost, which is that the ANC has simply accepted it got less than 50% of the election. It hasn't fought, hasn't argued, hasn't claimed the elections have been rigged. It has very meekly, correctly, but without a fight, simply started coalition negotiations. I mean, it strikes me that that's really important.
That's huge. And, I think that there's a number of factors at play there. Number one is that since last year, it's been fairly clear that the ANC would be likely to drop below the 50% mark. A lot of people predicting from back then that was the direction. We did have the talks chaired by Deputy President Paul Mashatile last year around coalition. So there was some kind of open conversation. Behind closed doors, there was already some conversation as well between political parties, both including the ANC and, of course, the multi-party charter. So, coalition has been the talk in South Africa for a while now. But you're absolutely right in that, the fact that the ANC just accepted the result and very quickly moved into talks is really important when you consider that, other national liberation movement and dominant parties of government in the region haven't done that. ZANU-PF doubled down. Frelimo in Mozambique will be going to the polls later this year and looks very unlikely to be unseated. The BDP in Botswana will be going to the polls this year in a very tightly contested election there. And it's not clear that they would do exactly the same as the ANC. So the ANC accepting this has been really, really significant. And I think that there are two real factors supporting that. One is that actually within the more principled and constitutional elements of the ANC, there is a real internal commitment to democracy and democratic process within the party. And the second factor, I think, is the strength of the electoral institutions and the system. Now, I know that obviously the IEC came under a lot of criticism from a number of the parties throughout this process. But actually, the way in which the process is set up and the system is set up does make it incredibly difficult for a party to abuse its incumbency. You've got party agents allowed at the count. The count happens live. And at every step of the way, you have both civil society and independent observers with a huge domestic observation system in South Africa that you don't see elsewhere on the continent. So you've got independent observers from civil society and partisan observers who, of course, are there scrutinizing every ballot paper in the count to make sure that their party isn't missing out. So a combination of those factors meant that it was very difficult for the ANC, would have been very difficult for the ANC to try and massage this in the first place. And so I think it had to come clean, accept the result, and move on very, very quickly in this kind of constitutionally mandated 14-day window. Why bother challenging when you've got a really big task ahead of you that you'll have no experience on?
Christopher, there's another aspect to all of this, which is as our democracy changes, or develops, or whichever word you want to use, it would seem, hopefully, that your vote as a South African voter, our vote just becomes more and more powerful as change becomes accepted, as we see more power changing hands in more places, not just in national government, but in provinces too. Look at KwaZulu-Natal, where I can't tell you what's going to happen there because it's so tight. Suddenly, the votes of individual voters become much more powerful. That, I would like to think, is a good thing for voters.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in interviews conducted ahead of the elections, it was clear that a lot of people were thinking of voting for the first time because they thought that there was going to be the prospect of change. And I think that, okay, even though we saw a relatively low turnout, around 58%, it's not the highest that South Africa has ever had. It's not low on kind of by international comparative standard. It's not kind of at the super low end of the spectrum. People did turn up, they did vote. And like I say, some of the people that I was interviewing earlier on this year and late last year, their intention for vote was exactly because they thought that there was a prospect of change. Now, the other side of that is that, okay, it's not at the lowest end of the spectrum in terms of turnout, but I think that people were hoping for a little bit higher turnout. And part of the reason for that is, and again, from kind of an international perspective and international observers looking at what's going on in South Africa, it's known that there's a very high level of politicization within South Africa and very high political awareness. And so the fact that there aren't super high turnouts is seen as a bit of a challenge of, well, that relationship between citizens and the state, citizens and government, a traditional relationship between voters and the ANC that's quite often been one of, when we support the ANC, we vote for them, but when we don't like what the ANC are doing, we withhold our vote rather than vote for one of the opposition parties. There's been a slight break from that. But clearly, I think that, within this next 5 years is going to be a bit of a litmus test on, is this now going to mean that for local elections in 2026 and for the next elections in 2029, we've seen this breaking of this myth that the ANC will be in power forever and we'll see people turning up and saying, yes, my vote counts? Or are people going to look at what's happening in this process and, we get to see what happens over the next, few days, let alone the next year or two? And is that going to lead people to think, well, there's this separation between the political class and irrespective of who we voted for, they all ended up in the same coalition. And so is it going to in some way decrease that bond between voters and citizens and the parties they elect? Because, the parties that are going to go into these discussions and have been talking for the last more than a week, they are acutely aware that their voter base has been voting for them for years now on the premise that if we vote for them, their job is to unseat the ANC. Now, that's what they've been marketing themselves as going to do. And on the first occasion where there's a real challenge put before them, they're going to have to make a very tough call of, well, we've been saying that we've been going to unseat the ANC, but now we might have to be the ones that will retain them in power. And certainly from some of the party leaders that I've spoken to, that's acutely present in their mind. That's a very, very live thought. And I think that that's part of what's making these negotiations so difficult. It's deeply personal and it involves a lot of different factors, including for these party leaders having to work in line with their party funders, work in line with their party members, sure, their MPs and their voting base. And for some of these leaders, it's difficult to discern, where the overlaps between those constituencies are and where the differences are.
Christopher Vandome, thank you very much indeed. Senior Research Fellow at the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Do appreciate the time.